So good afternoon. I'm Judy Koch. I'm the Richard and Elizabeth Curry Chief of Public Programming and Learning, and we're really excited to see all of you today. And I know more people will be joining us because we sold out this event, so they'll just have to make their way to the front and, suffer social shame and all of that. This afternoon, believe it or not, started as an idea between Kathleen, who's here in the front row, and myself at lunch. And she was speaking with excitement about Lord's new book, Learning in Museums, and wondering how to reach out to the Toronto community around the ideas in the book. Kathleen and I have both done a lot of our professional museum work in the States and worked in a number of different cities. And in those cities, there have been very, very active communities of people in museum learning. And we were noting with regret, I know that Chris has an active group in the Durham region, but we were noting with regret that there doesn't seem to be a center of gravity here in the city with people who do this work. And so we decided we would start a group. So you guys are the start of that group, and we'll talk more about how we might like to continue into the future at the end of today. But that's how we sort of put all sorts of great ideas together and ended up being here together today. I want to talk a little bit about what we have planned for the afternoon. We're going to have a series of 4 speakers who are going to do an overview of some of the ideas. Brad's going to do an overview of some of the ideas in the book. Then we picked out 3 ideas that we have 3 presenters to speak just for 10 minutes about that particular idea. And then we thought we'd split into small groups. And so you are going to be able to join the topic that you find most interesting, most relevant to your work, and we'll split into some small groups to kind of workshop those ideas and then come together as a big group again. We will have a break. There is coffee and cookies over here at the side, and so you're encouraged to help yourself, but we will also have a break. And the purpose of today is really to build community, to network amongst ourselves, and to think together for a while this afternoon. So in terms of housekeeping, there is a coat rack at the back. The restrooms are just down this hall to your left, and then it's left again. And with no further ado, I'm going to introduce Brad King, who has been with Lord for 16 years now, and he's going to be the first speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. Look, it's a tremendous pleasure to be here. This is our very first event to launch, I guess, the Manual Museum Learning 2nd edition. So big thanks to her and her team for putting this together. We really appreciate it. When you guys came in, you saw a looping video, an animation done by Kevin Belvin of our staff, and that introduces you to what I'm going to talk about, which kind of like a condensation of the book, 7 ways to transform museum learning. And in doing the research for the book, it is, I guess, those are the key things that we started to notice with regard to the ongoing progression and incredible development that we've noticed in museum learning over the past little ways. Before I get into those 7 ways and introduce each of them to you quickly, because I've got a time person here who's going to give me this, and if I go too long. But before I get into that, just a few general remarks about the book. When we first started to think about what this book was going to be about, we knew it wasn't going to be about just creating better museum education programs. This is really about top to bottom institutional transformation to become a 21st century learning organization, which is what museums are and what they're becoming. And we noticed a lot of that in our research. And then we thought, okay, why are they doing this? And the reason is that we want to have a social impact. Social service is the goal, and therefore to do that, we are becoming a lot more visitor-centric. We're looking at visitor needs and what they need to do, and thinking a lot more about our visitors and what they need in order to develop the institution as a learning institution. That leads us to the kind of learning that happens in museums, and we notice that it's moving kind of from the how more to, rather from the what, more to the how. Okay, so we're still going to learn about the subject matters of our particular institutions, no problem. We're still going to do that. But we're seeing a lot of emphasis, I guess a greater emphasis, on the how. And what we mean by the how is kind of like the soft skills, the ability to engage with people, the ability to talk to those who are maybe from another culture, creative thinking, innovative thinking. Everybody's sort of aiming for those kinds of outcomes now in their program. So in order to get to that place, we're transforming ourselves. We're becoming top to bottom focus on museum learning and transformation in order to affect those kinds of changes. So let's talk about the 7 main outcomes of the book. I guess I think there are a couple more, but we settled on 7 because they seem to be the strongest thing. But if you come up with more when you're reading the book, let me know. That would be good. Anyway, you saw this already. There are 7. I'm going to take you through each one. The first one is revisiting the mission. And we were struck that in just about every case, in the case studies and the research that we did, going back to the fundamental mission is what people always did. They always went back to the beginning. Foundational change is the root, as we say here, for optimizing conditions. And you know what? The greatest example from the book, I think, comes from chapter 8.1, which is the Columbus Museum of Art, which, if you follow the Journal of Museum Education, has already published a little bit about what they've done there. And they've done this kind of transformation there. And they were thinking when they went, they said, we got to do this complete top-to-bottom transformation. But how do we do it? And they looked at the mission, and they're thinking, well, so what are we about, art or people? And they realized we're about art and people. And that's what got into their mission statement. And that is the foundation and the place to stand, as we say here, for all the other upheavals they went through in transforming themselves. And there are upheavals. We wanted to focus in the book on real-world examples of people who've already been through this, because it's not easy. You know, there are a lot of different forces in museums, as you all well know, that can work for or against that. But anyway, mission is pretty critical and fundamental. I'm not going to talk too much about this because Mark McKay is going to talk about this, transforming ways of working. And by that I mean inside, internal ways of working inside the museum. And as I said to Mark, as I was chatting with him before, he's kind of the personification of that, digital director at the AGO. So he's the personification of a new way of working that is happening in this institution that is hosting this event right now. So that's really terrific. Don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this one because he's going to talk about it. But one thing I do want to say is that one good example of transforming ways of working is things like removing hierarchies, which is, again, is a notion we discovered in our research. Removing hierarchies in terms of coming up with new projects, for example. And that is, again, something we noticed from some of our case studies. In those institutions, anybody can propose an initiative. It's almost like a thesis defense, if you will. Hard questions are asked, but anybody can do it. So it's not just, say, the director of education that proposes initiatives. It's anybody can do it. And that helps the best ideas rise to the top. It helps museums maintain their relevance. So there is that. That's number 2. Number 3 is about adapting frameworks and supports. And you can learn a lot more about this in chapter 4 of the book, which is called Framework for Learning. Oh, thank you. Great, thanks, Dave. This will help people hear a little bit better, I hope. Anyway, I'm trying to use my projection voice, but I don't know if it's reaching the very far end, but this is a lot better. Anyway, frameworks and supports comes from chapter 4. If our output is to help people, as we say here, cope with a changing world, right? To cope with the changes in the world by teaching them at a high level some soft skills like creative thinking and innovative thinking and all those other kinds of good stuff that we do. We need to provide a certain number of supports to teach those skills and encourage those attributes that lead to those skills. So there are a number of these. You can see them listed here. They're set out in great detail in the book in chapter 4. Anyway, we think this is one of the cornerstone chapters of the book as well. Number 4, all staff are educators. Karen Carter from Myseum is going to discuss this in a little more depth. So again, I don't want to get too far into it. But Barb Soren and I were talking a little bit before about this one in particular, and we noticed it specifically from one of our case studies, the Memorial University of Newfoundland Botanical Garden. And there, they specifically say this. you guys are all got to be capable of dealing with visitors. You've all got to be able to work with those who cross your path and be able to engage with them in the way that we engage with visitors today, which is not in a didactic way, but now in a dialogic way. So as Kathleen Brown points out in her chapter, you got to have the skills to do that. It's not necessarily a given that we can just go and have anybody engage knowledgeably with visitors in a way that will draw out ideas from them as well in a dialogic way. So we have to have a little bit of training, but Karen will talk a little bit more about that. Approaching space holistically. We used to think, well, let's have a couple of classrooms. And that was it. We've got classrooms, we're good. Now we have to think in a lot more three-dimensional way, I think, in terms of space in order to support the kinds of outcomes we want to support with museum learning. And that can be things like, as we say here, we may have to think about multi-purpose uses of formerly single-use space, for example. Or we might have to think about, well, we've got this certain kind of program, what adjacencies do we have to have? Or what access points do we have to have? So space planning and facility planning needs to be thought of, again, as a way to support our ultimate goal, museum learning, to support broader social outcomes. Measuring what matters. Judy Koch is going to talk about measuring what matters. This struck me from the chapter by Charlie Walter. Charlie Walter is director of the Mayborn Museum Complex in Texas. And Charlie's an operations guy. He's not really a museum educator at all. He's now a director, but he started in operations. And he noticed that as they started from the mission, revitalizing their mission towards a more effective learning organization, that there were all kinds of things they were already measuring that could be used to better effect to enhance museum learning. So I learned that from him, and I learned it from some of the other people as well who contributed to the book. And Judy's going to fill us in on what we do here at the AGO on that measure. The final one is embracing continuous change. We want to support people to help cope with the world. Okay, we need to keep learning ourselves as museum professionals. We have to be open to that. We have to think of our ways of working as a process, which is always changing. As new inputs, visitor needs change all the time, for example. We have to be on top of that. We have to be attuned to what people are thinking. We have to be tuned to what visitor needs are so that we can ourselves change. And therefore, we have to be set up in that way. I just got the finger from Rebecca, so it just so happens we're just about done through this. I want to turn it over now, without any further ado, to Mark McKay. And Mark is going to talk about point number 2. Thanks, Mark.
All right, thank you, Brad. A little bit about me. I started my career in the music industry before Napster transformed the industry. I lived through the digital transformation of the television industry. I was at the forefront of the digital transformation of marketing with social media and content marketing. I helped evolve digital in the university sector, and now I'm here at the AGO to transform the gallery. Technology and access to information have become a way of life for many of us. Could you imagine doing your job without a computer or your phone or email or a word processor, or life without Facebook, Google, or Netflix? There's an expectation today that all businesses have a digital experience, and many of us provide one but could do better. And to do that, we need to evolve. There's 3 big challenges facing the transformation of the work, and they are planning, execution, and communication. We need to move from a linear way of planning to an additive way. We need to move from specialized to democratized execution. And in communicating, we need to move away from me to we. Traditional approaches to planning have been a waterfall. One step can't happen before the one that came before it. If you have to go back, you usually have to start all over again. And by the time a project is complete, you risk no longer meeting the customer's needs. Agile is a model formalized by software developers in a manifesto released in 2001. It's an adaptive planning and evolutionary development process where we deliver early and we're continuously improving, and it encourages rapid and flexible responses to change. Work is scheduled in short sprints, usually lasting 3 or more weeks, and it's focused on shortening the feedback loop to ensure that when a product does go to market, it isn't out of date. And this comic here really sort of summarizes the difference between the two approaches. Whereas one, it's about delivering this massive project, where the other is really just about delivering small bite-sized sections of the project so that the individual pieces lead to the whole. Now, I really advocate for a hybrid approach where we use a waterfall for our strategic planning, but our teams who are executing the work are using an agile approach so that we're constantly pushing product out the door or incrementally moving our projects forward, while at the same time ensuring that we have the strategic oversight that we need from our leadership teams and other clients across the organization. The second thing that needs transformation is the way that we go about executing our work. This is a meme that I saw on LinkedIn earlier this week, and I shared on my network and has since gone viral. And I think that it doesn't just relate to strategy, but I think it's really true of all the work that we do. We don't live in a, digital isn't a separate thing anymore. It's part of the world that we live in, and we need to embrace it in everything that we do. And work has evolved from a manual labor and menial work, and many of the things that we've done have become automated processes. And today what constitutes as skilled or unskilled labor is becoming more relegated to our ability to work with technology. And so just as the workplace has evolved, so too have the tools that we use. We've gone from using typewriters to MS Word, from letters to email, but the evolution doesn't stop there. We must continue to evolve and adopt new tools like content management systems, software as a service, and other digital technologies, both hardware and software. And we need to ensure that our workforce is properly equipped to do this work. It's not just training them to do the work, but making it part of the work that they do by putting it in their job descriptions. And if we don't, we'll die by the axiom of culture eats strategy for lunch, because no one will adopt these new ways of working. Once in place, we need to properly train our teams, have gatekeepers in place to be supporters and advocates and leaders within each group in our organization, and then have a support network in order to be there to help each unit across our business succeed. Finally, we need to transform communication. How many people here do online research before they make a purchase or decide to go out and do an experience? Yeah, many of you. Now, these stats here are from 2014, but I would hazard to guess that these numbers are much higher today. When we talk about content, we are putting it into very broad categories, and those are rational and emotional. Rational is that functional content that is information about our business, what we're selling, the price, where to park. And emotional content are the stories that make people want to come. It's aspirational and it makes a personal connection. And we need both types of content if we want to convince and convert our audiences to take action. By creating emotional content through vehicles like blogs and social media, we increase awareness and engagement. And more importantly, we develop leads and drive sales, contributing to our bottom line. And the purpose of all of this content creation is to create a loyalty loop. Marketers used to live and die by the marketing funnel, where you would start with a large pool of prospects that get whittled down to a few sales. But today, smart marketers are using content to create ongoing exposure and engagement with those who have already purchased in order to win a place in the hearts and the minds of their customers. So the next time that they purchase, they no longer need to go through the consideration and evaluation, but instead choose your products first. And so these are the three areas that I see from a way that we work that we need to really evolve our workplaces. And it starts with the way that we plan our projects, and then the way that we organize ourselves to execute them, and then the way that we communicate out to our customers. And that's what I have for you. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. How are you all? Good? You're smiling, so that means you've been engaged so far. That means they've warmed up. As introduced, I am lucky enough to be the executive director at Myseum of Toronto. We are a museum without walls. We're very lucky to have a board chair and founder, Diane Blake, who is in the room. So if you have an interest in why she decided to put herself into this situation, you can ask her personally later. But we started doing some research initially as a team about the need for a museum for Toronto, why one had not occurred. And one of the things we were told was there's this fixation on a building, and that the fixation on the built form and all the money needed for that traditional model really derailed the plan. I have a cold, so you'll excuse me if my voice goes in and out. So we were lucky enough that Diane could find folks in the community who were willing to work with a small team to develop a museum that kind of challenged that traditional model and said, why not use the city as a museum? And intrinsic into that is this idea around education, not just being even the responsibility of the staff, but it became the responsibility of the community that we played with. So for us, education is really about that dialogue. As Brad mentioned, there's a symbiotic experience that is intrinsic throughout everything that we do, from the grassroots cultural organizations who are the keepers of their local community stories to the major institutions like the ROM and the AGO, who are doing work that positions the city on an international scale. So for us, public participation was the key first marker out of the gate. We launched in May of 2015, and we spent all of that time of 2015 basically meeting with any and everybody we could in the sector. And for us, the sector was defined very broadly. It was about those who were interested in Toronto and in the Toronto story. So it meant the small mom and pop shops that were individual keepers of a particular cultural community or geographical location story, where literally we were off of Atomic Avenue in back stores of personal businesses that had given a couple of community people from the Portuguese community a space for the Portuguese History Museum to live, to going into North York to talking to folks at the Multicultural History Society at the Columbus Center. So that range and that span really gave us a sense of what the public lay of the land was, and it allowed us to map the city not only geographically, as it took us from Etobicoke and Scarborough and North York for what is we know as the Toronto's downtown core and inner suburbs, but it also took us regionally, because we chose to look at public participation and at our constituents as those who were of and from Toronto. So you were either in the city and saw yourself as a Torontonian because this is where you lived and worked and played, made your life, but you also may have a connection to the city as someone who is living now in Markham or in Mississauga or Brampton, because as we know, a lot of those communities have grown out of the growth and the expansion of this region. So understanding Toronto as a regional city helped us with making some of those key synergies. And when we started to connect the dots, one of the things that came to mind, and it's interesting that I was invited to participate in this because it actually came from a conversation with Gail and her team when Diane and I went to check in with them and to do a bit of a progress report on what we were doing. The conversation led to, well, why aren't we just putting all of these different organizations who aren't necessarily speaking to each other in the room together? So that, again, the notion of education then became not just about us going to talk to people about what they envisioned Myseum to be and how they might co-create with us and engage not only with us but with each other, but how do we take a decision and take our programming to actually have a core educational element be a part of it out of the gate. So it was interesting as I was reading through, just quickly scanning through, I haven't read the whole book. I don't know if that was required for me to be up here. I read the whole book. But that element of just the institution, starting with what is your core belief at the nucleus, at your heart, what is your interest in being a lead educator within a broader community context. So for us, having the sector, young people who were coming out of museum studies programming, as well as those who were established in institutions in the room together to talk about where museums and culture is. And even just breaking down those walls and those silos and throwing people in the room together based on just being in the arts, and the fact that artists and cultural animators could engage with museum studies professionals. So this idea of looking at the sector more broadly became a really key component as to how we move forward. Youth became a key component for us because, again, as we looked at education and thought about what are we learning as a small team, there's 6 of us, and it only became 6, a month ago, Josh, that we added you to the team. So our idea of who we are as an organization is very much not just about staff, but about the small team of the 5 board members and the staff, and then the small advisory committee. And so this community of people who are interested in city building and a museum becomes a key educational component for us. And the youth who are sometimes not necessarily interested in museums per se, but they're interested in culture, allowing them a seat at the table for building this notion of a Museum of Toronto became a key component for us. Within the team, as far as our professional development, actually I lied, there's only 5 of us. Why did I think there was 6? Must be Diane. Diane's in the office every day, so we just call her staff. So it's the interns. That's how we got to 6. We have a model within the team where we all are charged with professional development as not being something top down that we have a meeting and we say, okay, here's what I need you to professionally develop on. But every member of the team, because this is such a collaborative process, is looking at researching where are the things that you might want to take a course on locally, as well as nationally or internationally. Obviously, the international piece goes to budget, so we're like, yeah, we don't have that kind of money. That's a big dream. But let's maybe map that out for down the road to look at where are the conferences that we should be speaking at, where should we be presenting, but also where should we be learning about some of the best practices that are happening globally. So we all, as a team, take responsibility for the professional development of how we then contribute to that education process. Intersecting perspectives is a key component that has come out of this business model and our approach to museum making. There's a couple of shots here that highlight the Intersections Festival, Myseum Intersections, that's been happening through the month of March. And that has been a really fascinating way of us throwing out to the community. We see Toronto as a city that is not of one pillar. It is a city that is all about connectivity. We are all multiple facets of what we may have been if we grew up somewhere else. Because we live in this city, we probably have a much more global palette with regards to food. Our music knowledge and interest is probably wider because of the music festivals and other free things that happen in this city. And we also have a much more familiar sense of culture and world cultures because of the way this city engages and interacts across places and spaces and cultures. So this festival was another layer for us because it really allowed us to say, okay, how do we go about, one, asking organizations from different places to play and engage with each other, but how do we also drive people to actually experience events and to do that out of their comfort zone in different places within the city. So we've seen with just the test of this as our first major programming output, this festival, that it's really highlighted for us that so far the model seems to be working. We're brand new, so we're still figuring things out, and with that newness comes all of this freedom. And you layer on top of that a small team. Our board is only 5 people. It gives you this level of flexibility that I'm sure some of you are looking at me going, I hate that Karen Carter. Why does she have all that flexibility and I don't? You want to be me when you grow up. I do. It's not a bad place to be. Am I done early? So I can pick on people? No. Oh, okay. That's not enough. It's not enough time. Thank you for inviting me and the Myseum team to participate in this, especially because, as I said, we're really new and just getting out of the gate. But my one final thought will be that to think about education for your team as a collaborative, to charge your staff to be as engaged as your board and as your community to the education process.
So again, I'm Judy Koch for the people that came in a bit later. I'm from the AGO, and I'm not actually going to talk about the evaluation and the research we do here at the AGO because that's what works for us. And it's really particular, asking questions about your audience is really particular to the time and place that your organization is in a particular moment. I think the need to really do this work is becoming increasingly important, and for two main reasons. One is the reason of public value. It's becoming exceedingly important for us as a field to be able to actually speak, not just that we know in our bones that what we're doing is important, but to have evidence of what we're doing and that it's important. The second thing is we're actually using this agile project management sort of thinking to do our new, to build our new website, and we're trying to think of ways to integrate it into our practice because we do everything in a very slow and linear way, and we do need to become more agile. And I find that museum people are a bit afraid to move from a known to an unknown model because they're not sure it's going to work, and it's so hard to affect change in our organizations in the first place that it's scary to move to something that you're not sure it's going to work. But if you have the attitude that it's a test and you're collecting data, right? You're not doing a test if you're not collecting data. So setting up a test and collecting data helps you decide whether you move the needle in the direction you wanted to move, which means that you've actually defined success, because you can't measure success if you haven't defined it. So I just want to talk a little bit about what kinds of evaluation and research we can do. There are different kinds of data we're collecting. Most of us are collecting the second tier, the outputs, how many people, how many school groups, how many publications distributed, how many events, those sort of accounting pieces. And we use that. That talks about what we do, but it doesn't establish for anyone that we're making a difference in people's lives. Collecting audience data and information is also, it's not just the bodies, but who's coming and who's not coming, because the who's coming helps you understand who's not coming. So both the demographics and of course the psychographics, the why are people coming, what do they need to feel like they've had a successful experience at your organization. Then we start thinking about, so what? What difference are we making? And when we think about individuals, we think about outcomes. So what's the difference in the individual because of their time in your program or in your exhibition? And cumulatively across a population, we think about the impact. This is tricky when you read in this area. Some people call impacts benefits, and then they call outcomes impacts. So it's it's at the community level and the individual level. So the reading in the area is kind of fuzzy, but really thinking about what's the difference we're making to the city of Toronto. My staff's going to shudder because I tell the story all the time, but in the early 90s, New York City pulled away its funding. Oh, there's someone here from Manhattan, right? So you probably weren't working then, though. Pulled a lot of their funding away from the city museums and libraries, and people picketed, most on behalf of the libraries, and nobody picketed for the museums. And Alan Friedman, who was then the director of the New York Hall of Science, said, we'll know as a community, museums will know they make the difference when people picket for us. So what is it we need to do differently to really be that vibrant part of people's lives? And that's what we're starting to explore in understanding our public value and developing an ability to talk about it. One thing I just want to talk about, because we use this a lot, we use the motivational identities. We think about a model of why people are coming. If 5 people sit around the table or one person's at a table planning a program or an exhibition, they build that for themselves. But our audience is much more diverse and has all kinds of different people with different needs. So thinking about the different reasons why people come and what they need. In the early 90s, we all used Howard Gardner as sort of a model, models of intelligence, trying to diversify our experiences. We think a lot about the Falk motivations. doesn't really matter what you use. There's the Ignite the Power of Art out of Dallas. The Tate has a large model, but using some kind of model to help move your thinking from what you need and want and would enjoy to a broader audience is really important. This is actually, we did a long interview with 600 people and saw what our visitors, what the pie chart looks like on a given day. You're not permanently in one of these identities. If you think about why you go to a museum, when your Aunt Betty's in town, and why you go to a museum when you're with your friends, you want two different kinds of experiences. So this was a huge shock to people here, because the art aficionado is somebody who has almost like a quasi-professional understanding of art. They read art, they make art, they go to art museums regularly, and our staff would have guessed that was at least 50% of our audience, and they're not. So having the evidence of why people are coming and what they need to have a positive experience is one of the key things that I think we could all be collecting data on. Thinking about those outcomes and impacts, and I stole this from Doug, who's in the room. So we think a lot about different indicators of success. And when we think at the individual level, we think about people's ability as a result of their participation with us to generate new insights, or really affirm their values. We're a family that loves learning, or this is something I find interesting, dealing with complexity, dealing across culture. And these are all things that with the right instrument you can actually measure a change in people. When we think about community and understanding community impact, we think more about generating connections, which is this is just defining what Karen's trying to do, and Karen and her staff, engaging diversity, creating spaces for civil discourse, people coming together and becoming really effective partners. This is harder to measure, so Karen's got a harder job than I do in terms of measuring impact, perhaps. But there are a couple of different things I want to suggest. One is that if you can find research that indicates that a certain set of conditions offers a result. So I'm thinking there is research that indicates that parents who read to their children every night, that those children grow up to be better readers. So if you can then show evidence that your program increases how much parents read to their kids, you can reach through that to the research and say, therefore, I'm making better readers. Okay, so it's worth it to go out into the research world and look for social science research that supports the end goal, the community impact you're trying to make, and then connect your work to that work in terms of supporting public value. The other thing is we don't use partnerships with universities enough, in my opinion. There are all kinds of people doing a master's in education or psychological development that would love really needy projects to work on. So I think becoming better partners, working together. What if we all identified an important question and for a year we asked that question in the work that we do? So thinking creatively about how we can gather these data is really important. This is from Alan Brown, and he looks at public value. So the whole conversation about public value kind of rocketed in museums in 1996 with Mark Moore's publication of Public Value. That was an interesting book. Doug Wertz has done a lot of work in this area. Carol Scott from Australia. Gail Lord's new book on the soft power of museums. So this is an area where not just economic impact, museums have done a fair amount of work proving that because people visit them and they have jobs and they buy stuff, that they have that positive economic impact on their community, but that those other impacts, social impacts and a more cohesive community are really important, and there's a lot of good work on the Wolf Brown website that you can also access if you're looking to connect with that.